The explosion arrived before the sound ever could. Deep beneath the scarred battlefields of Eastern Europe, a heavily fortified underground command complex sat hidden beneath layers of reinforced concrete, steel blast doors, and decades of military engineering. Its commanders believed they were protected by one of the most sophisticated defensive networks ever assembled on the continent. Radar systems watched the skies. Missile batteries stood ready. Intelligence officers monitored every movement across hundreds of miles of front lines. Then, without warning, a massive precision-guided bomb descended from the clouds. There were no desperate fighter interceptions racing toward the target, no overwhelming NATO air response, no emergency reinforcement packages arriving from across the Atlantic. Within moments, the bunker vanished beneath an expanding cloud of dust and fire, sending shockwaves through military planners far beyond the battlefield itself. The question was immediate and terrifying. Where was the shield that Europe had relied upon for generations? For decades, European security had been built around a simple assumption. If a major crisis erupted, American military power would arrive in overwhelming force. Strategic bombers, advanced fighter squadrons, nuclear submarines, intelligence networks, and logistics capabilities would combine to create a protective wall that no adversary would dare challenge. But that assumption was beginning to crumble. Behind closed doors, a dramatic shift was unfolding inside the corridors of power. A series of strategic decisions in Washington had started to reshape the entire balance of military power across Europe. What many leaders initially dismissed as temporary adjustments soon revealed themselves as part of a much larger transformation. The message delivered to European capitals was blunt. The era of unlimited American protection was ending. For years, policymakers had debated whether Europe was carrying enough of the burden for its own defense. Rising tensions in the Middle East, increasing competition in the Pacific, and growing pressure on American military resources had forced difficult conversations inside the Pentagon. Every aircraft carrier deployed to one region meant fewer resources elsewhere. Every fighter squadron assigned to Europe represented capabilities unavailable for other emerging crises. Eventually, those debates evolved into action. The first signs appeared quietly. Military analysts noticed subtle changes in deployment schedules. Planned exercises were scaled back. Reinforcement timelines became less ambitious. Certain reserve formations that were once expected to deploy rapidly during emergencies began disappearing from contingency plans. At first, few paid attention. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. Across Europe, commanders realized that the military architecture supporting NATO's deterrence strategy was slowly being restructured. The permanent presence remained visible, creating an illusion of stability, but the hidden layers beneath it were changing rapidly, and Moscow was watching every move. Russian military doctrine has long emphasized the importance of identifying moments of weakness. Throughout history, the Kremlin has repeatedly sought opportunities when opponents appeared distracted, divided, or uncertain. Strategic patience has often been one of its most powerful weapons. Now, Russian planners believed they were witnessing exactly such a moment. As questions emerged regarding America's future commitments, confidence began growing inside Russian military circles. What previously looked like an untouchable alliance suddenly appeared vulnerable. Not weak enough to be defeated outright, but potentially weak enough to be tested. That distinction mattered enormously, because modern geopolitical competition rarely begins with full-scale war. Instead, it starts with probing actions, pressure, calculated risks, attempts to discover how far an opponent can be pushed before resistance emerges. Across the front lines, Russian aviation units gradually adopted a more aggressive posture. Aircraft that had previously operated cautiously began flying with greater confidence. Long-range strike missions increased. Reconnaissance activity intensified. Strategic planners examined scenarios that only a few years earlier would have seemed dangerously ambitious. The reason was simple. The most powerful element of Western military strength was never merely its weapons. It was uncertainty. Potential adversaries never knew exactly how much force the United States might deploy in response to a crisis. The possibility of sudden escalation often discouraged risky behavior before conflicts could even begin. But uncertainty cuts both ways. Once that fear begins to fade, entirely new calculations become possible. Inside NATO headquarters, officials were becoming increasingly concerned by intelligence reports suggesting that Russia viewed the changing strategic environment as a historic opportunity. Discussions that had once focused on maintaining deterrence were now shifting toward preventing deterrence from collapsing altogether. The problem was not that America was abandoning Europe overnight. The reality was far more complicated. Major military bases remained operational. Existing troops remained stationed across the continent. Aircraft continued flying routine patrols. Publicly, alliance unity remained intact. Yet beneath the surface, critical capabilities were being reduced. And those capabilities happened to be the very systems responsible for responding during the first days of a major conflict. Reserve fighter wings that would normally reinforce Europe during emergencies were no longer guaranteed to arrive. Strategic bomber allocations were being reconsidered. Naval resources faced increasing demands elsewhere around the world. Military planners understood the implications immediately. Wars are often decided long before the first shots are fired. They are decided by logistics, reinforcement capacity, intelligence superiority, and the ability to rapidly concentrate force at critical locations. When those factors begin changing, the entire strategic equation changes with them. Russia understood this. European leaders were beginning to understand it. And the battlefield was becoming the place where those consequences would be measured. As air operations intensified across Eastern Europe, Russian strike aircraft increasingly relied on a weapon that perfectly exploited this emerging reality: massive guided glide bombs. Unlike traditional bombs that require aircraft to approach dangerous targets closely, modern glide bombs can be released from significant distances. Equipped with guidance systems and extended-range wing kits, they allow aircraft to remain far from enemy defenses while still delivering devastating firepower. Against heavily fortified positions, their effectiveness can be extraordinary. Defensive networks built over years can be destroyed in minutes. Underground facilities become vulnerable. Supply depots disappear. Command centers cease functioning. Every successful strike creates pressure on the defenders, forcing them to spend resources repairing damage while preparing for the next attack. Military analysts began warning that if enough of these strikes were concentrated against critical sectors, the cumulative effect could become overwhelming, not because of a single bomb, but because of relentless repetition. Day after day, week after week, the objective would not simply be destruction, it would be exhaustion. And exhaustion has often proven more dangerous than firepower itself. Throughout military history, even the strongest defensive lines have eventually collapsed when subjected to continuous pressure. Ammunition runs low, equipment wears out. Personnel become fatigued, decision-making deteriorates. What makes the situation particularly dangerous is that modern warfare accelerates these processes dramatically. The campaign that once required months can now unfold within weeks. Precision weapons strike targets with unprecedented accuracy. Intelligence systems identify vulnerabilities faster than ever before. Long-range missiles allow attacks against logistics networks hundreds of miles from active combat zones. The battlefield no longer begins at the front line. It extends across entire countries. This reality was forcing European defense planners to confront uncomfortable questions. What happens if American support arrives more slowly than expected? What happens if key capabilities are unavailable during the most critical phase of a crisis? And perhaps most importantly, what happens if adversaries believe those capabilities may never arrive at all? Those questions would soon become even more urgent, because while Europe focused on challenges in the air, another strategic transformation was unfolding thousands of miles away, one that would ultimately pull American attention toward an entirely different region of the world and create consequences that few NATO officials had anticipated. Far from the battlefields of Eastern Europe, another crisis was rapidly climbing to the top of Washington's priority list. For years, American military planners had prepared for the possibility that multiple geopolitical flashpoints could erupt simultaneously. The challenge was never identifying threats. The challenge was determining which threats would receive limited military resources first. As tensions intensified across several regions of the world, difficult choices became unavoidable. One of the most significant concerns centered on a narrow stretch of water that carries a substantial portion of the global energy supply, the Strait of Hormuz. This strategic corridor has long been considered one of the world's most important maritime choke points. Every day, massive quantities of oil and natural gas pass through its waters. Any disruption has the potential to send shockwaves through international markets, affect energy prices worldwide, and trigger economic consequences far beyond the Middle East. Military planners understood the risks perfectly. A prolonged disruption could damage global supply chains, weaken allied economies, and create instability across multiple continents. As regional tensions escalated, Washington began reassessing the distribution of its military assets, and that reassessment carried consequences for Europe. The most valuable naval resources in the American arsenal are not always aircraft carriers or surface warships. Often, they operate entirely unseen. Nuclear-powered attack submarines represent some of the most sophisticated weapon systems ever created. Their ability to gather intelligence, track enemy vessels, launch precision strikes, and dominate underwater battles makes them indispensable during major crises. For decades, these submarines played a critical role in maintaining security across European waters. Their presence created constant pressure on potential adversaries. Their surveillance capabilities helped monitor naval activity. Their strike potential served as a powerful deterrent. Most importantly, they ensured that hostile submarines rarely operated without concern. But as strategic priorities shifted, some of America's most capable underwater assets were reassigned to other theaters. The decision was driven by global calculations rather than European considerations alone. Military leaders believed future challenges elsewhere required immediate attention. Yet every redeployment creates consequences. Resources sent to one region are resources unavailable elsewhere. As American submarines concentrated on emerging threats beyond Europe, a new reality began taking shape across the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and surrounding waters. The security environment was changing, and Russia noticed. Naval warfare remains one of the least visible aspects of modern military competition. Unlike fighter aircraft streaking across the sky or armored vehicles advancing across open terrain, submarines operate in silence. Most people never see them. Many never think about them. Yet they possess the ability to influence entire conflicts. The single submarine can threaten shipping routes, gather intelligence, launch long-range missiles, and force opponents to devote enormous resources toward locating it. This invisible contest beneath the ocean surface suddenly became far more important. Russian naval commanders recognized that reduced American underwater activity created opportunities that had not existed before. Submarine patrol patterns became more aggressive. Operational zones expanded. Maritime surveillance detected increased activity in regions that previously experienced heavier NATO monitoring. The implications extended far beyond military symbolism. Modern economies depend upon secure maritime transportation. Commercial shipping routes function as arteries connecting global markets. Disrupting those routes can generate economic pressure that rivals traditional military operations. Strategists often describe this as fighting without directly attacking an opponent's territory. Instead of targeting cities, one targets the systems that sustain them. The possibility of increased submarine activity therefore raised concerns among defense officials across Europe. Not because an invasion seemed imminent, but because uncertainty itself creates strategic leverage. Every convoy requires additional protection. Every shipping route demands greater surveillance. Every potential threat consumes resources, and resources are never unlimited. The challenge became even more complicated because Europe lacked sufficient numbers to fully replace America's underwater capabilities. Several European navies possess highly advanced submarines and anti-submarine warfare platforms. The problem was scale. Advanced technology matters enormously, but numbers matter too. A handful of excellent submarines cannot simultaneously monitor every region where threats may emerge. As maritime responsibilities expanded, European commanders faced increasingly difficult decisions regarding priorities and coverage areas. The result was a growing sense that the strategic burden was shifting faster than existing defense structures could adapt. While these developments unfolded at sea, events on land continued accelerating. Russia was not simply observing NATO's internal adjustments.